Paul Miller woke up to the gentle chime of his alarm clock, just as he had every morning for the past 15 years. The smell of freshly baked bread already lingered in the air, a comforting aroma that seemed to embody his life's work. His bakery, Miller's Hearth, was more than a business. It was the heart of the small town of Cedar Hollow, a place where neighbors gathered, stories were exchanged, and moments were shared over steaming cups of coffee and flaky croissants. Paul loved his work, not for the income it provided, but for the joy it brought to his community. That morning seemed no different from the countless others he had experienced. The sun rose gently over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. Paul arrived at the bakery an hour before opening, as always. He unlocked the front door, flipped on the lights, and got to work. Mixing dough, kneading it with practiced precision, and sliding trays into the ovens gave him a sense of purpose he cherished deeply. The town began to wake up, too. Through the large bay windows of the bakery, Paul could see people starting their day, joggers running down Main Street, shop owners opening their doors, and the early risers heading to work. A few regulars arrived right as the bakery opened, as they always did. Mrs. Thompson, the retired school teacher, ordered her cinnamon scone with a knowing smile. Mike, the local mechanic, grabbed his usual black coffee and bear claw. Everything felt ordinary. Peaceful. Perfectly normal. But then, the sound of screeching tires shattered the tranquility. Paul looked up, startled, as a loud crash echoed through the air. His heart raced as he rushed to the window, his apron flapping behind him. Just outside the bakery, a small blue sedan had slammed into a telephone pole. Smoke billowed from the hood, and the windshield was spiderwebbed with cracks. Without hesitation, Paul bolted out the door. A small crowd of onlookers had already started to gather, but no one seemed to know what to do. Paul pushed his way through, his heart pounding. Inside the car, he saw a man slumped over the steering wheel, motionless. "Someone call 911. Paul shouted, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. The man in the car was in his late 40s, with graying hair and a weathered face that told a story of hardship. Paul tugged at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. He sprinted back to the bakery and grabbed a tire iron from under the counter. He kept one there just in case of emergencies. Returning to the car, he wedged the iron into the doorframe and pried it open with a grunt of effort. The acrid smell of smoke and gasoline filled his nostrils as he gently pulled the man from the wreckage. The man groaned softly, his eyelids fluttering open. "You're okay," Paul said, trying to sound reassuring despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Help is on the way." The man's lips moved, but his voice was barely audible. Paul leaned in closer to hear him. "Daniel," the man whispered. "My name is Daniel." Paul nodded. "I've got you, Daniel. Just hang on." Moments later, the wail of sirens grew louder, and an ambulance pulled up to the scene. Paramedics rushed out, taking over and carefully loading Daniel onto a stretcher. As they worked, Paul noticed something odd. Daniel was clutching a crumpled piece of paper in his hand, refusing to let it go. Curiosity gnawed at Paul, but he respected the man's privacy and didn't pry. He watched as the ambulance drove away, its flashing lights disappearing down the street. The crowd began to disperse, and the murmurs of speculation faded. But Paul couldn't shake the image of Daniel's face from his mind, the pain in his eyes, the desperation in his voice. Back inside the bakery, Paul tried to resume his routine, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Daniel. Who was he? What had led him to that moment? Was he okay now? Later that day, after closing the bakery, Paul decided to visit the hospital. He didn't know why he felt so compelled to check on Daniel. Maybe it was the look in the man's eyes or the way he had clung to that piece of paper. Either way, Paul couldn't ignore the pull. At the hospital, Paul learned that Daniel was stable but still under observation. The nurse hesitated when Paul asked to see him. Are you family? She asked. No, Paul admitted. I was the one who pulled him from the car. I just wanted to make sure he's hardship. Paul tugged at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. He sprinted back to the bakery and grabbed a tire iron from under the counter. He kept one there just in case of emergencies. Returning to the car, he wedged the iron into the doorframe and pried it open with a grunt of effort. The acrid smell of smoke and gasoline filled his nostrils as he gently pulled the man from the wreckage. The man groaned softly, his eyelids fluttering open. "You're okay," Paul said, trying to sound reassuring despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Help is on the way." The man's lips moved, but his voice was barely audible. Paul leaned in closer to hear him. "Daniel," the man whispered. "My name is Daniel." Paul nodded. "I've got you, Daniel. Just hang on." Moments later, the wail of sirens grew louder, and an ambulance pulled up to the scene. Paramedics rushed out, taking over and carefully loading Daniel onto a stretcher. As they worked, Paul noticed something odd. Daniel was clutching a crumpled piece of paper in his hand, refusing to let it go. Curiosity gnawed at Paul, but he respected the man's privacy and didn't pry. He watched as the ambulance drove away, its flashing lights disappearing down the street. The crowd began to disperse, and the murmurs of speculation faded. But Paul couldn't shake the image of Daniel's face from his mind, the pain in his eyes, the desperation in his voice. Back inside the bakery, Paul tried to resume his routine, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Daniel. Who was he? What had led him to that moment? Was he okay now? Later that day, after closing the bakery, Paul decided to visit the hospital. He didn't know why he felt so compelled to check on Daniel. Maybe it was the look in the man's eyes or the way he had clung to that piece of paper. Either way, Paul couldn't ignore the pull. At the hospital, Paul learned that Daniel was stable but still under observation. The nurse hesitated when Paul asked to see him. "Are you family?" she asked. "No," Paul admitted. "I was the one who pulled him from the car. I just wanted to make sure he's..." Paul couldn't shake the thoughts of Daniel and his daughter as he walked back to the bakery that evening. The man's story lingered in his mind like an unfinished song, a melody that begged to be resolved. The bakery, usually a source of comfort and joy, felt strangely empty when Paul stepped through the door. He glanced at the photos on the walls, snapshots of customers over the years, families smiling, children holding pastries as big as their faces, and it hit him, Daniel didn't have this anymore. He didn't have a place where he belonged. Paul knew what it was like to feel lost. Though he rarely talked about it, he had faced his own share of struggles. After his parents passed, leaving him the bakery in their will, he'd nearly sold it to pay off mounting debts. But something had stopped him, a sense of duty, perhaps, or a belief that the bakery was more than a business. It was a legacy. Now, as he stood among the warm, golden glow of his ovens, he realized that helping Daniel might be his way of giving back, a chance to help someone rediscover their own sense of purpose. The next morning, Paul arrived at the hospital early, carrying a box of freshly baked croissants. When he entered Daniel's room, the man was sitting up in bed, staring out the window. His face lit up slightly when he saw Paul. "You're back," Daniel said, his voice tinged with both surprise and gratitude. "Brought you breakfast," Paul said, setting the box on the table beside him. "I figured hospital food isn't exactly gourmet." Daniel chuckled, the sound dry and unfamiliar, as though laughter were something he hadn't done in years. "You figured right." He opened the box and pulled out a croissant, the buttery layers flaking in his hand. For a while, they ate in comfortable silence. Then Paul leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day," he began. "About your daughter." Daniel froze, his croissant halfway to his mouth. "What about it?" Paul hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I think you should reach out to her. Write her back. It's clear you care about her. Daniel set the croissant down, his jaw tightening. It's not that simple, he said. I've written letters before. She never responded. Maybe this time will be different, Paul said gently. What do you have to lose? Daniel didn't answer right away. He stared at the box of croissants, as though the answer might be hidden among the crumbs. Finally, he sighed. I wouldn't even know where to start. Paul's mind raced. He hadn't expected Daniel to agree so quickly. I can help, he offered. If you want, we can write the letter together. Daniel looked at him, his eyes searching. Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. Paul smiled. Maybe not. But I know what it's like to need a second chance. And I think everyone deserves one. Over the next few days, Paul and Daniel worked on the letter together. It wasn't easy. Daniel struggled to find the right words, often tearing up the paper in frustration. Paul encouraged him to keep going, reminding him that honesty was the best approach. Finally, they finished a letter that felt genuine, a heartfelt apology and a plea for understanding. Paul mailed the letter himself, feeling a mix of hope and apprehension as he dropped it into the mailbox. Daniel's fate was now in his daughter's hands. Meanwhile, Paul's life at the bakery continued, but he found himself increasingly distracted. He couldn't help but wonder how Daniel's daughter would react. Would she respond? Would she forgive him? The questions weighed on him, but he didn't let them show. Then, about a week later, something unexpected happened. A man in a suit walked into the bakery just before closing. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately caught Paul's attention. Are you Paul Miller? The man asked. Paul nodded, wiping his hands on his apron. That's me. Can I help you? The man handed him a business card. Name's James Carter. I'm with the Cedar Hollow Veterans Outreach Program. I heard about what you've been doing for Daniel. Paul blinked, surprised. How did you? Word gets around, James said with a small smile. It's a small town. Paul chuckled nervously. I guess it is. So, what can I do for you? I wanted to thank you, James said. Not many people would go out of their way to help a guy like Daniel. But I also wanted to offer my help. The outreach program has resources, therapy, job training, housing assistance. If Daniel's willing, we can get him the support he needs. Paul felt a surge of relief and gratitude. That's incredible. Thank you. When Paul told Daniel about the outreach program, the man was skeptical at first. I don't want charity, he said gruffly. It's not charity, Paul insisted. It's a chance to get back on your feet. You've been through a lot. Let them help you. Daniel hesitated, then nodded slowly. I'll think about it. Days turned into weeks, and while Daniel began working with the outreach program, Paul continued to visit him at the hospital. Their friendship deepened, and Paul learned more about Daniel's past, his time in the military, the horrors he'd witnessed, and the mistakes he'd made afterward. But just as things seemed to be improving, the first twist arrived, a letter from Daniel's daughter. It came on a gray afternoon, delivered to the hospital in an envelope with no return address. Daniel stared at it for a long time before opening it. Paul sat beside him, silent but supportive. When Daniel finally unfolded the letter, his hands trembled. He read it in silence, his expression unreadable. Then he handed it to Paul. She wants to meet, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. She wants to talk. Paul felt a surge of hope. That's great, Daniel. That's your chance to make things right. Daniel nodded, but his face was clouded with doubt. What if I screw it up? What if she hates me? You won't know until you try, Paul said. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. Daniel was nervous, and Paul did his best to reassure him. "Just be honest," he said. "She'll see that you've changed." When the day finally arrived, Paul drove Daniel to a small cafe on the outskirts of town. As they pulled into the parking lot, Daniel froze. "There she is," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Paul followed his gaze and saw a young woman sitting at an outdoor table, her posture stiff and her face wary. Daniel took a deep breath, then stepped out of the car. Paul watched from a distance as Daniel approached his daughter. At first, their conversation seemed tense. But then, something shifted. The young woman's expression softened, and she reached across the table to take Daniel's hand. Paul smiled to himself, feeling a warmth in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, things were finally starting to fall into place. But as he drove back to the bakery that evening, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Whatever lay ahead, it was clear that Daniel's journey, and his own, was far from over. The day after Daniel reunited with his daughter, Paul was back at the bakery, kneading dough with a sense of satisfaction he hadn't felt in weeks. The rhythm of his hands pressing into the soft dough matched the steady thrum of his thoughts. He couldn't help but replay the scene from the cafe in his mind, the hesitant way Daniel had approached the young woman, the glint of cautious hope in her eyes, and the tentative connection they had begun to rebuild. It was moments like that which reminded Paul why he had stepped into Daniel's life in the first place. Yet, as fulfilling as it was to see progress, Paul also knew better than to think everything would resolve so easily. Life had a way of throwing curveballs, and it wasn't long before the next one came hurtling toward them. The first sign of trouble arrived in the form of an envelope. It was a plain, unassuming thing, sitting on the bakery counter amidst receipts and order forms. Paul almost didn't notice it as he worked through the morning rush. But when the crowd thinned out, curiosity got the better of him, and he tore it open. Inside was a notice of intent to foreclose on the property. Paul's stomach dropped as he read the details. Apparently, a clause in the mortgage agreement had gone unnoticed when he refinanced the bakery years ago. The lender had the right to demand immediate repayment of the remaining balance, and for reasons Paul couldn't fathom, they were exercising that right now. He stared at the letter, his hands trembling. The amount they were demanding was astronomical, far more than Paul could afford, even with the bakery doing well. A sinking feeling settled in his chest as he realized what this meant. Without the bakery, he'd lose everything. For a moment, Paul considered keeping the news to himself. He didn't want to burden anyone, least of all Daniel, who was just beginning to rebuild his own life. But as the hours ticked by, the weight of the secret became unbearable. That evening, after closing the bakery, Paul drove to Daniel's temporary housing unit. Daniel greeted him with a cautious smile. "Didn't expect to see you tonight," he said, stepping aside to let Paul in. "I didn't plan on coming," Paul admitted, sitting down on the worn sofa. "But something's happened, and I need to talk to you about it." Daniel's brow furrowed. "What's going on?" Paul hesitated, then handed him the foreclosure notice. "The bakery's in trouble," he said simply. Daniel read the letter in silence, his jaw tightening. When he finished, he looked up at Paul, his expression grim. "How much time do you have?" 30 days, Paul said. "Maybe less." Daniel sat back, running a hand through his hair. "This doesn't make sense. Why would they do this now?" Paul shook his head. "I don't know. All I know is, if I can't come up with the money, I'll lose everything." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel leaned forward, a determined look in his eyes. "You've done so much for me, Paul. Let me help you." Paul frowned. "Daniel, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," Daniel interrupted. "You gave me a second chance when no one else would. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. The least I can do is return the favor." Paul wanted to argue, but he could see the sincerity in Daniel's eyes. Reluctantly, he nodded. Okay. But we have to be smart about this. The bakery can't just survive, it has to thrive. Over the next few days, Paul and Daniel brainstormed ways to raise the money. They considered crowdfunding, hosting community events, and even reaching out to local businesses for sponsorships. But every idea they came up with seemed either too risky or too time-consuming. The clock was ticking, and they needed a solution fast. Then Daniel had an idea. What if we did a charity bake sale, he suggested. Not just here at the bakery, but all over town. We could partner with local schools, churches, and community centers. Get everyone involved. Paul considered the idea. It was ambitious, but it had potential. That might work, he said. But we'd need a lot of volunteers. And ingredients. And everything, really. Daniel grinned. Leave that to me. True to his word, Daniel threw himself into the project with a determination that surprised even Paul. He reached out to the Veterans Outreach Program, rallying other former service members to help. He spoke at town meetings, convincing local leaders to support the cause. He even tracked down a few old military buddies, who donated supplies and equipment. As word spread, the community began to rally around Paul and the bakery. Neighbors volunteered their time, teachers organized bake sales at their schools, and even rival businesses chipped in. It was as though the town had been waiting for an opportunity to come together, and Paul's plight gave them a reason to unite. The day of the charity bake sale dawned bright and clear. Tables lined Main Street, covered in an array of pastries, cookies, and cakes. The smell of freshly baked goods filled the air, mingling with the sounds of laughter and conversation. Paul stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. Everywhere he looked, he saw familiar faces, customers, friends, and even strangers who had come to help. Looks like we did it, Daniel said, walking up beside him. Paul smiled, his eyes misty. I couldn't have done this without you. Daniel shrugged. You gave me a reason to believe in myself again. This is the least I could do. By the end of the day, the bake sale had raised enough money to save the bakery, with some left over to cover future expenses. But the event had done more than just raise funds, it had strengthened the bonds within the community, reminding everyone of the power of unity and kindness. As Paul locked up the bakery that night, he couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. The road ahead might still be challenging, but he knew he wouldn't have to face it alone. And yet, deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. For both him and Daniel, a new chapter was about to unfold, one filled with possibilities, challenges, and the promise of redemption. In the weeks following the charity bake sale, the bakery felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. Customers poured in, not just for the pastries but for the story behind them. People who had never stepped foot inside the shop were now regulars, drawn by the idea of supporting a local business that had become a symbol of resilience and community spirit. Paul could barely keep up with the demand, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel optimistic about the future. But even as the bakery flourished, Paul couldn't help but notice a restlessness in Daniel. At first, it was subtle, a far-off look in his eyes, a hesitation in his voice when Paul asked how he was doing. But as the days turned into weeks, the signs became harder to ignore. Daniel, who had thrown himself so fully into helping save the bakery, now seemed adrift, as if he were searching for something he couldn't quite name. One evening, after the bakery had closed for the night, Paul found Daniel sitting on the bench outside, staring up at the stars. A half-empty cup of coffee sat beside him, forgotten. Mind if I join you? Paul asked, stepping outside and leaning against the doorway. Daniel glanced up and nodded. Sure. For a moment, they sat in silence, the quiet hum of the town settling around them like a blanket. Finally, Paul broke the silence. You've been a little quiet lately. Everything okay? Daniel didn't answer right away. He took a sip of his coffee, then set the cup down with a sigh. I don't know, he admitted. Things are better now, I guess. But I still feel like something's missing. Paul frowned, unsure of what to say. Do you think it's about your daughter? He ventured. Daniel shook his head. No. Things with her are good, better than I ever could have hoped for. We're taking it slow, but she's letting me be a part of her life again. He paused, his brow furrowing. It's more than that. It's like I've been given this second chance, but I don't know what to do with it. Paul nodded slowly, understanding. You're looking for purpose. Yeah, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. The conversation stuck with Paul long after Daniel had left. He thought about the man who had once been so lost, who had found a spark of hope in the most unlikely of places. But Paul also knew that finding hope was only the beginning. Purpose, that elusive sense of meaning, was something Daniel would have to discover for himself. The next morning, as Paul worked in the bakery, an idea began to take shape. It was risky, perhaps even a little crazy, but if there was one thing Paul had learned over the past few months, it was that sometimes, taking a chance was the only way forward. Later that day, he approached Daniel with the idea. What if you came to work at the bakery? Paul asked, handing Daniel a cup of coffee as they sat in the small break room. Daniel looked at him in surprise. Me? Work here? Why not? Paul said with a shrug. You've got the skills, and you've already proven you can handle the pressure. Plus, it might give you the sense of purpose you're looking for. Daniel hesitated, clearly taken aback. I don't know, Paul. I've never worked in a bakery before. You helped organize a town-wide charity bake sale, Paul pointed out with a grin. I'd say that counts for something. After a moment's thought, Daniel nodded. All right, he said. I'll give it a shot. The transition wasn't without its challenges. Daniel struggled at first to adjust to the fast-paced environment of the bakery, and there were more than a few mishaps, though that didn't rise, pies that burned, and one memorable incident involving an overzealous attempt at decorating a cake. But Daniel was nothing if not determined, and with Paul's guidance, he began to find his footing. As the weeks went by, Daniel's confidence grew. He learned how to perfect the art of shaping croissants, how to balance flavors in a cake, and even how to handle the customers with the same warmth and charm that Paul had mastered over the years. But it wasn't just Daniel who changed. The bakery itself began to evolve, taking on a new energy that reflected the partnership between the two men. Paul, who had always been content to keep things simple, found himself inspired by Daniel's ideas for new recipes and creative promotions. Together, they introduced a veteran special, a rotating menu item with proceeds going to the local outreach program, and started hosting monthly community events at the bakery. One such event, a storytelling night, drew a particularly large crowd. People from all walks of life came to share their stories, from childhood memories to tales of resilience and hope. Daniel, at Paul's urging, took the stage to share his own story, the journey from a lost veteran to a man who had found his way back through the kindness of a stranger and the support of a community. The room fell silent as Daniel spoke, his voice steady but full of emotion. When he finished, the crowd erupted into applause, and several people approached him afterward to thank him for his honesty and courage. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt truly seen, not as a broken man but as someone with a story worth sharing. Yet, as life at the bakery flourished, another twist was on the horizon. One afternoon, Paul received a letter from a local developer interested in buying the property. The offer was generous, more money than Paul had ever dreamed of, but it came with a catch. The developer planned to tear down the bakery to make way for a luxury apartment complex. Paul was torn. The money would provide financial security for years to come, but the thought of losing the bakery, the heart of the community, was unbearable. He shared the news with Daniel, who immediately saw the dilemma in Paul's eyes. "What are you going to do?" Daniel asked. "I don't know," Paul admitted. "It's a lot of money. But this place means so much to so many people." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe it's not just your decision to make." Paul looked at him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "Ask the community," Daniel said. "They're the reason this place survived. Let them have a say." The idea resonated with Paul, and he decided to hold a town meeting to discuss the offer. The response was overwhelming. People from all over the town came to share their thoughts, their voices filled with passion and determination. In the end, the decision was clear. The bakery wasn't just a business, it was a symbol of what the town could achieve when they came together. With the community's support, Paul declined the offer, choosing instead to invest in the bakery's future. As Paul and Daniel stood outside the bakery that evening, watching the sun set over the town, Paul felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. "We did the right thing," Daniel said, his voice steady. "Yeah," Paul agreed. "We did." But even as they celebrated their victory, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. For every ending, there was a new beginning, and for Paul and Daniel, the next chapter was waiting just around the corner. Life at the bakery settled into a comforting rhythm after Paul's decision to keep the business. The community had rallied to preserve the space that had become a cornerstone of their town, and the newfound sense of purpose in Daniel's life had only deepened. He was thriving, not just as a baker but as a vital part of the community. Paul watched with quiet pride as Daniel found his place, connecting with customers, mentoring young volunteers, and even introducing new recipes that quickly became local favorites. Despite the day-to-day contentment, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty looming over them. Paul began noticing small signs that not everything was as stable as it seemed. Suppliers started reporting price increases, utility bills crept higher, and while the bakery remained popular, the margins were tighter than ever. Paul found himself lying awake at night, spreadsheets spread across his dining room table, trying to figure out how to make it all work. Daniel, for his part, could sense Paul's worry, but Paul brushed off his concerns. "I've handled tough times before," he'd say with a dismissive wave. "This is nothing I can't figure out." But Daniel knew better. He saw the dark circles under Paul's eyes, the way his shoulders sagged at the end of the day, and the forced brightness in his smile. One quiet morning, when the bakery was empty except for the smell of rising bread and the hum of the ovens, Daniel decided it was time to push Paul to talk. He cornered him in the back kitchen as Paul was cleaning a mixer. "Paul," Daniel began, his voice firm but kind, "we need to talk about what's going on. I can tell something's up." Paul sighed, not bothering to deny it this time. He set down the cloth he was using and leaned against the counter. "It's the costs," he admitted. "Everything's more expensive now, flour, sugar, rent. Even with all the support from the community, it's hard to keep up. I'm barely breaking even some weeks." Daniel nodded, processing the weight of Paul's words. "What can we do?" he asked after a moment. "I don't know," Paul said honestly. "I've thought about raising prices, but I don't want to alienate our regulars. And cutting corners isn't an option. We built this bakery on quality, and I'm not going to compromise that." Daniel frowned, deep in thought. Then, an idea began to take shape in his mind. "What if we expanded?" Paul blinked at him. "Expanded?" "Daniel, I just told you we're struggling to make ends meet as it is." "Not the bakery," Daniel clarified. "Our reach. Our brand. Think about it, people all over town love what we do here. Why not bring the bakery to them?" Paul looked skeptical. "You mean like delivery?" "More than that," Daniel said, his excitement growing. "Pop-up shops. Farmers markets. Corporate catering. We could even start selling packaged goods, cookies, pastries, bread, things people can take home and enjoy whenever they want. Paul rubbed his chin, considering the idea. That's ambitious, he said finally. But it could work, Daniel pressed. We've got the community behind us, and people already know the bakery's name. It's risky, sure, but it might be the only way to keep this place going. Paul hesitated, torn between the safety of the familiar and the potential of the unknown. Finally, he nodded. All right, he said. Let's give it a shot. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Daniel threw himself into the project with the same determination he'd shown during the charity bake sale. He reached out to local event organizers, secured permits for farmers' markets, and even pitched the idea of corporate catering to several local businesses. Paul focused on developing a line of packaged goods, experimenting with recipes late into the night until he found the perfect balance of flavor and shelf life. Their first pop-up shop was held at the town's monthly farmers' market. They set up a simple booth with a banner that read, "Paul's Bakery, a taste of home." The display was piled high with an array of treats, from buttery croissants to chewy chocolate chip cookies. The response was overwhelming. Customers flocked to the booth, drawn by the familiar name and the enticing aroma of freshly baked goods. By the end of the day, they had sold out of everything, and several people had placed orders for delivery. Encouraged by their success, Paul and Daniel expanded their efforts. They began attending markets in neighboring towns, setting up pop-up shops at community events, and even landing a few catering gigs for local companies. The bakery's name spread far beyond the borders of their small town, and with it came a steady stream of new customers. But with growth came new challenges. The demands of the expanded business stretched their resources to the limit. Paul and Daniel found themselves working longer hours, often collapsing into bed well after midnight only to wake up before dawn to start again. They hired a few part-time employees to help, but even with the extra hands, the workload was immense. One particularly hectic week, when a large catering order coincided with a farmer's market and a corporate event, tensions ran high. Paul snapped at Daniel over a botched batch of cookies, and Daniel fired back, accusing Paul of taking on too much. The argument escalated until Paul threw up his hands. "I'm just trying to keep this place afloat," he shouted. "And I'm trying to help." Daniel shot back. "But we can't do everything, Paul. We're going to burn out if we keep pushing like this." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Paul sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "I don't want to lose this place, Daniel," he said quietly. Daniel sat down across from him. "Neither do I. But we've got to find a balance. We can't do it all ourselves." They spent the rest of the night talking, re-evaluating their priorities and coming up with a plan to scale back without sacrificing quality. They decided to focus on the areas that brought in the most revenue, packaged goods and catering, while cutting back on the number of pop-up shops and events. The changes weren't easy, but they paid off. With a more focused approach, Paul and Daniel found themselves with the breathing room they needed to not only sustain the bakery but to enjoy the journey as well. The bakery continued to thrive, and with each new milestone, Paul and Daniel grew closer, their partnership evolving into a friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. One evening, as they locked up the bakery after a particularly successful day, Paul turned to Daniel with a smile. "You know, I never thought I'd be doing any of this," he said. "Pop-ups, catering, packaged goods, it's not what I imagined when I started this place." Daniel grinned. "Life has a funny way of surprising you." Paul nodded, his smile fading slightly. "I couldn't have done it without you, Daniel." "You didn't have to," Daniel said simply. "That's what friends are for." As they walked away from the bakery, the neon sign glowing softly in the night, both men felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They had faced challenges that could have broken them, but instead, they had risen to meet them, forging something stronger in the process. And though the future remained uncertain, they knew one thing for sure: together, they could face whatever came next. As the bakery continued to grow, Paul and Daniel found themselves navigating a world neither had expected to be a part of, a regional food scene that was gaining national attention. Their packaged goods, particularly a signature item called Paul's Delight, a soft, cinnamon-laced pastry with a caramel glaze, had gained a cult following. Orders were pouring in not only from nearby towns but from further afield, thanks to an enthusiastic food blogger who had discovered their products at a pop-up event and raved about them online. The unexpected publicity brought challenges and opportunities in equal measure. Paul, ever the perfectionist, worried that scaling up would dilute the bakery's soul. He insisted on maintaining the handcrafted quality of their goods, even as the volume of orders threatened to overwhelm their small team. Daniel, who had become adept at managing the operational side of things, worked tirelessly to find ways to expand production without compromising their standards. It was during one of their late-night brainstorming sessions that Daniel floated a radical idea: they could partner with a local co-op of small bakers and suppliers to fulfill larger orders while still retaining control of their core recipes and brand. Paul was hesitant at first. His entire career had been built on the principle of doing everything himself, but Daniel's logic was hard to argue with. "If we don't find a way to grow sustainably," Daniel said, "we'll burn out, or worse, let down the people who believe in us." Paul eventually agreed, and together, they reached out to local artisans and bakers, forming a coalition that would allow them to scale production while preserving the handcrafted touch that had made them so popular. The arrangement was a success, and soon, Paul's bakery-branded goods were appearing in specialty shops and farmers' markets across the region. With this newfound success came the chance to give back in a way that Paul and Daniel had always dreamed of. They established a scholarship fund for aspiring bakers, offering mentorship and financial support to individuals who wanted to pursue careers in the culinary arts but lacked the resources. The first recipient of the scholarship was a young woman named Clara, who had been volunteering at the bakery since high school. Clara's story resonated deeply with Paul and Daniel. She had grown up in a single-parent household, working part-time jobs to help make ends meet while nurturing a quiet passion for baking. When she received the scholarship, she cried tears of gratitude, and her joy reminded Paul and Daniel of why they had fought so hard to keep the bakery alive. But just as things seemed to be settling into a new normal, a twist emerged that neither Paul nor Daniel could have anticipated. One afternoon, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the bakery, and a well-dressed man stepped out. He introduced himself as Andrew Blake, a representative from a major national food brand. Blake had come with an offer. His company wanted to acquire the bakery's brand and recipes, with the promise of bringing Paul's Delight and other signature items to grocery stores and cafes across the country. The money on the table was staggering, enough to ensure financial security for both Paul and Daniel for the rest of their lives. Paul was stunned. The bakery had been his life's work, and the thought of handing it over to a corporate giant felt like a betrayal of everything he stood for. Daniel, however, saw potential in the offer. Daniel said later that evening as they discussed the proposal, "This could change everything. We'd have the resources to do so much more, to help more people, reach more communities. Isn't that what we've always wanted?" Paul shook his head. "But at what cost? This place isn't just a business, Daniel. It's a part of this town, a part of us. What happens when it becomes just another product on a supermarket shelf?" The tension between them grew as they debated the decision over the following days. For the first time in their partnership, they found themselves on opposite sides of an issue that went to the heart of who they were and what they valued. In the end, they decided to call a meeting with their employees, the scholarship recipients, and a few trusted members of the community. They laid out the situation, presenting both the pros and cons of the offer. To their surprise, the response was overwhelmingly in favor of turning down the deal. "This bakery isn't just about the food," Clara said during the meeting. "It's about the people. It's about the story. You can't put a price on that." The clarity of her words cut through the noise, and Paul and Daniel found themselves nodding in agreement. They informed Blake of their decision the next day, thanking him for his interest but explaining that they couldn't sell the bakery without losing what made it special. The decision brought a renewed sense of purpose to the bakery. Paul and Daniel doubled down on their community initiatives, launching a series of free workshops to teach baking skills to anyone who wanted to learn. They also began hosting monthly, community bake nights, where residents could gather to share recipes, swap stories, and bake together. These events became a highlight of the town's calendar, drawing people of all ages and backgrounds. One particularly memorable night saw a group of elderly women teaching a group of teenagers how to make traditional recipes from their childhoods. The sight of generations coming together over the simple joy of baking filled Paul's heart with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. But perhaps the most profound moment came one quiet evening when Daniel approached Paul with a box of old photographs. Inside were pictures from Daniel's days in the military, snapshots of his daughter as a child, and a few faded images of him and his late wife. "I've been thinking a lot about purpose," Daniel said, his voice tinged with emotion. "And I realized something. This bakery saved my life, Paul. It gave me a reason to keep going when I thought I had nothing left. And now, I want to make sure it keeps doing that, for me, for you, and for everyone who walks through those doors." Paul reached out and placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "We'll do it together," he said. "No matter what comes next, we'll face it as a team." As the bakery's neon sign cast a warm glow over the street that night, Paul and Daniel stood side by side, looking out at the community they had built together. The challenges they had faced had tested them in ways they never could have imagined, but they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever. The bakery wasn't just a place to buy bread or pastries, it was a testament to the power of resilience, the strength of community, and the magic that could happen when ordinary people came together to do extraordinary things. And as Paul locked the door and Daniel flipped the closed sign, they knew one thing for certain: the story of the bakery was far from over. Its legacy would live on, in the lives it had touched, the hearts it had healed, and the dreams it continued to inspire.